Italy had not been a unified nation since about 475 AD when the Roman Empire fell. Instead, they were a loose confederation of different countries with different rulers, different dialects, different cultures. The only thing they really had in common by the 1800s was the Roman Catholic Church and this new growing sense of nationhood. As you proceed through this video, it'll become abundantly clear the effects of inbreeding on the downfall of hereditary leaders throughout Italy. I mean, one can also say nationalism, the rise of it, led to it, more militaristic societies, all the isms that exist in the 1800s, but certainly we get a bunch of really kind of quite nutty leaders during this time period. Charles II lived earlier. Actually, his death and the lack thereof of an heir is going to be the cause of the War of Spanish Succession. So a major war breaks out in Europe over the fact that Charles II is so inbred. Here he is right here. And he's so inbred that he's infertile and he can't have children. And so when he dies, and that infertility, by the way, had gone all throughout this family tree. This is the Habsburg family tree of Spain. It continues on through their Austrian relatives who also take over most of Italy and then continue to marry within the family over and over and over and over. And here are the new type of leaders that replace this hereditary monarchy that was based on just accident of birth. Here's Mazzini. He was from an educated background. He was a teacher. Here's Garibaldi. He was from actually a fisherman and from, he was self-motivated, went into the military. And here's Cavor. He was a count. He was born into the aristocratic class, but he was super intelligent. And so these new intellectual and strong-minded leaders will rise up, and that's what is going to unify Italy. Italy had a major problem in 1815 in that Napoleon had invaded and turned all of these countries that existed upside down. And so we're going to see that as leaders are deposed. And then in 1815, with the defeat of Napoleon, you get the reestablishment of what it was like prior to Napoleon's rise. So Piedmont right here and Sardinia are reunited under the House of Savoy. Milan, the gas capital of Lombardy, Venetia, is going to stay within the Austrian Empire. Members of the Austrian family are going to be put in Parma and Tuscany, and they're going to control the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So Austria really comes out very strong with the defeat of Napoleon and ends up pretty much ruling this area. Up until Napoleon, this had been the kingdom of Naples, which included Sicily. After the Restoration, there's an agreement made, and it becomes the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and their first leader becomes a king. But understand that all of the power was in Naples. Here's our first king of Naples, King Ferdinand I. You'll see him under different names because, again, he starts as king of Naples, and then when he's restored in 1815, he becomes King Ferdinand I of Two Sicilies. He was a very repressive, tyrannical man. He's going to die in 1825, but what he's most famous for is his wife. His wife was Maria Carolina of the House of Habsburg. She was a daughter of Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria, and his sister to Marie Antoinette. This woman hated Napoleon and set herself up as one of his enemies. She was very dominant in government as well. Her marriage contract actually required that she have a say in government. So she will rule the most. These next two guys we're going to move through really quickly. Here's Francis I of Two Sicilies. He had a first wife, died. He married his first cousin, and unfortunately they had 11 children. The oldest daughter ends up marrying her uncle in Spain. So, let's just leave it at that. Here's King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies, and he was fairly liberal at first, and then in 1848 he turns into a conservative. He marries Maria Cristina of Savoy and has his heir, who will be Francis II, but she dies soon after his birth, and then his second wife is his first cousin, Maria Theresa, yes, another Maria Theresa of Austria. They were related on the maternal side. Francis II was king, the last king, during Garibaldi's invasion and proved to be kind of inefficient and weak. Even though he was rather popular, he was married to Duchess Maria Sophia of Bavaria from the House of Wittelsbach, which had their own set of crazy. They did not have a happy marriage, and as a result, they had no living children. The Papal States was a series of territories in the Italian peninsula that was under the direct sovereign rule of the Pope. They were among the major states of Italy from roughly the 8th century until the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia successfully unifies the Italian peninsula by 1870. At their zenith, the Papal States covered most of central Italy. These holdings were considered to be a manifestation of the temporal power of the Pope. The popes had lost their power over central Italy under Napoleon, but that was certainly restored in 1815, and they were given their territory back under the Congress of Vienna. Pope Pius VII had the unfortunate job of being pope during the time of Napoleon. He's going to be at Napoleon's coronation as emperor, and then later in 1809, he actually excommunicates Napoleon, which in a sense says you no longer have the right to rule. And so Napoleon responds by kidnapping him. And so from 1809 to 1814, he's in prison in France. He's been kidnapped by Napoleon. He's released after that and restored to all of his power, but dies in 1823. Pope Leo XII will not reign for long. He was in ill health when he became pope. He was extremely conservative. He'll even reinstate the Inquisition as a reaction to this new movement of liberalism, nationalism, and the rise of Italian unification. Sometimes when picking a new pope, they can't come to a consensus. And so one of the things we'll see very often actually within the papacy, we just saw it in our own living lifetime with Pope Benedict, is that they will elect somebody that is ill health or, that won't last for long, is very old, in a way to kind of stabilize time and allow things to move forward as they pick usually the next pope who's going to be very strong. I mean, it's generally the same trend that we see today, we're going to see here. Pope Gregory XVI was certainly a very strong absolutist. He hated any kind of liberalism, definitely an absolutist pope. He was also very extravagant. So you add those two things and he becomes incredibly unpopular. Pope Pius IX is probably our most important of our popes. And we're going to see that he's going to reign during a time that is incredibly important during Italian unification. So we'll see him a lot. He was like a lot of leaders. He was liberal before 1848, and then that turns him into a conservative. He becomes so conservative that he orders fig leaves to be placed on all the statues in the Vatican and other churches around Rome. The central duchies were the Duchy of Parma, Modena, and Tuscany. Sometimes Lucca, which is off to the side right here, but more often that is with Tuscany. Each of these was going to be ruled by a Grand Duke, sometimes from the House of Habsburg in Austria, and sometimes from the House of Bourbon, depending on the time period. The Duchy of Tuscany actually went back to the 1400s under the de' Medici, who ruled all the way up into the 1700s when the last de' Medici Duke died without an heir, and so it passed to one of his sister's children, which was the House of Bourbon in Spain. It will be restored under after Napoleon's reign, but it will be very closely attached to Austria at the same time. Grand Duke Ferdinand III will rule before Napoleon, be deposed by the French Republic, then he'll rule again, be deposed by Napoleon, and then he'll be restored in 1815 and dies in 1824. He was a very reactionary ruler, and he also married his double first cousin, so you can imagine what's going to result from that. And here's the last ruler of Tuscany. After him, Tuscany will be absorbed into the new Italian nation. He did marry Maria Antonia of Naples, and they did go on to have several children, but by then Tuscany was no longer a kingdom. The Duchy of Modena suffered from very inbred, weak rulers during the time period between 1815 and 1860, and as a result it left it very unstable and open to many of the beginnings of the revolutions in 1820, 1830, and again in 1848. Duke Francis IV of Modena. I mean, this guy's nuts. He married his niece, first of all, and as a result, his line ends with the death of his oldest son, who we'll see next. It's also important to note that he reinstated the Jesuits, who were the shock troops of the Vatican. Today we know them for education, but then they were troops, they were warriors, and they promoted Catholicism wherever it was threatened, even if they had to kill people to do that. And their arch enemies were those opposed to power and influence of the Catholic Church. And so, this is problematic, and he was not a nice guy at all. And here's the last ruler of Modena. He had no children. He was his own cousin, so that was probably a good reason why he could not have children. And he married into the house of Wittelsbach, which also, again, had its own problems with insanity and infertility. The Duchy of Parma was restored to the House of Habsburg-Lorraine after the defeat of Napoleon, and then given to the emperor's eldest daughter, who had married Napoleon. The Grand Duchess Marie Louise of Austria was, raised to hate Napoleon, and then at a very young age, she suddenly finds herself, married to him, married to the enemy. But she was happy at the time, and then he was defeated, and they gave her the country of Parma, and so she becomes the Grand Duchess there. She lived a life after that. She marries twice, organically. They weren't legal, they couldn't legally inherit, but she marries twice, has many more children. Her son with Napoleon unfortunately dies young, but she'll go on to live a pretty life, and she was kind of moderate, and as a result we won't see too much revolution in Parma, but they will be absorbed by the new Italian nation. The kingdom of Piedmont or Sardinia actually went back to the 1300s. They rose in prominence through the House of Savoy because they controlled the only passes through the Alps mountain that connected to the Mediterranean. And so they grew very wealthy and continued to reign, and then will be the leading force of Italian unification in the 1800s. Our first three kings of Piedmont, Sardinia were very conservative and reactionary. It's going to take a younger generation to come about and push forward unification. So King Victor Emmanuel I was king during Napoleon's time. Of course, he lost control of his kingdom, and by 1821 there's a revolution in this area, and he's going to abdicate in favor of his brother, who they all thought would be less conservative, and it turned out he was not. Victor Emmanuel I did not have children, so we can see that the inbreeding is kind of catching up to the House of Savoy, and actually King Charles of Felix becomes the next king. He was a younger brother of Victor Emmanuel, and guess what? He will not have children as well, and so when he dies, the throne actually goes to a distant cousin. King Charles Albert of Sardinia was known as the hesitant liberal, so he does do some liberal changes, and he begins to want two things. He wants Italy to be freed from the House of Habsburg and replaced by the House of Savoy, and especially northern Italy. He's going to marry, though, into the House of Austria, which was quite a conflict. But then he begins to conquer northern Italy, and he fails by 1848, and as a result, he has to abdicate in favor of his son, who will finish the job of Italian unification. In Italy, King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia is known as the father of the fatherland. His reign will be important in that it oversees the unification of Italy, so we will see him a lot. He did marry his first cousin, Adelaide of Austria, as we see his mother was from Austria as well, and they will have one son who will later be assassinated. The kingdom of Lombardy and Venetia was recreated after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. Lombardy and Venetia were constituent lands of the Austrian Empire. They were created in 1815 by a resolution of the Congress of Vienna in recognition of the Austrian House of Habsburg-Lorraine's direct rights over Lombardy and the former Republic of Venice. It will remain under the control of Austria until 1866, when its remaining territory was incorporated into the new Kingdom of Italy. It bears mentioning that the main foes of Italian unification are going to be the emperors and statesmen of the Austrian Empire, or the House of Habsburg in Lorraine, from 1815 to 1870. Francis II was the last of the Holy Roman Emperors, and he had the unfortunate job of being emperor during the time of Napoleon. It is his daughter, actually, who marries Napoleon, Maria Louise of Austria. He's also the last Holy Roman Emperor. When Napoleon conquers Germany, he ends the Holy Roman Empire, and as a result, Francis II has himself declared Emperor of Austria. He had 4 wives, and I was like, oh my gosh, 4 wives? Did he kill them? No, they all died either in childbirth or of sickness at the time. Only one of his sons survives him. And that son was crazy. He was incapable of ruling his empire because he had a mental deficiency. So his father, before he died, made a will which made sure that Ferdinand would consult Archduke Louis, his uncle, on all aspects of internal policy, and urged him to be influenced by Prince Metternich. He had many problems, as you can see from these pictures. He actually marries Maria Anna of Savoy, who the people loved because they saw that she was a nurse. They had no children. I mean, he was unable to consummate the marriage. It was claimed as many as 20, 25 seizures per day. And when he tried to consummate his marriage, he had 5. So they will have no children. Here is the diplomatic architect of Napoleon's defeat, Prince Metternich. He was an Austrian statesman, and he's going to lead the Council of Vienna and rule over much of Europe from 1815 to 1848 as he tries to roll back all liberal policies and institute absolute monarchy again, suppress freedom of the press and those kind of things. He wanted conservative policies. And remember, the emperor at the time is a blithering idiot, and so this guy's in charge. Here is Prince Felix Schwartzenberg of Austria. Why is he important? In 1848, he's going to really be the architect of having Emperor Ferdinand abdicate the throne in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph. We will talk about Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria all the way up into World War I. He had a very long reign from 1848 to 1960. He was known as the Emperor of Sorrows because his wife will be assassinated by an anarchist, and his son commits murder-suicide with his mistress. And so in the end, Franz Joseph is only allowed to, he only has one heir left, and that'll be Franz Ferdinand. That guy gets shot. So, he's known as the Emperor of Sorrows as a result. This is one of the most famous field marshals in history, and the reason why he's important is he's going to defeat Piedmont in 1848. If it hadn't been for him, perhaps Italian unification would have happened earlier. It bears mentioning that the 1800s were a period of instability for France. They're going to go from a republic to an empire under Napoleon, back to an absolute monarchy for a time, then to a constitutional monarchy, then back to an empire, and then to a military dictatorship after that. So very, very intense time for France. Remember this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte, started out as a military general, took power, first consul, then emperor, then conqueror of all of Europe, and then defeat. This is King Louis XVIII. He was actually the younger brother of King Louis XVI. He took the 18th in honor of his deceased nephew who died during the Revolution, who would have or should have been King Louis XVII. He married Marie Josephine of Savoy, and at times he spent much of the French Revolution on the run in Piedmont with her family. They did not have children. When he's restored, he tries to implement liberal policies to try to have, he's a moderate during that time, which often put him at odds with his yet younger brother who will inherit the throne next. King Charles X of France did have children, but they'll be forced to give up their title. In the end, his direct line dies out in 1883. He will rule from 1824 to when he's exiled in 1830. And again, he was a yet younger brother, even further more conservative. He was married to Maria Theresa of Savoy. Louis Philippe becomes king of the French. He's the first. Rather than king of France, he is king of the French people. And he is instated. He's from the other side of the branch of the Bourbons, the Duke d'Orléans. And he's instated by revolution, the July monarchy, and he promised liberalism, but yet he was a secret conservative. He married Maria Amelia of Naples, He's going to be forced to abdicate in the Revolution of 1848, which brings Napoleon III to power. Here is Napoleon III. He was a nephew of Napoleon, and he was president of the Second French Republic from 1848 to 1852. And then he pulls a fast one and becomes emperor of the French. He turns it back into an empire. And he serves as Emperor of the French from 1852 to 1870. He's going to interfere a lot in Italian politics, and he's really actually known for his great love affair. When he announced his engagement, he said, "I have preferred a woman whom I love and respect to a woman unknown to me, with whom an alliance would have had advantages mixed with sacrifices." So he married for love rather than politics. The kings of Great Britain during this time were a lot of crazy people. They all came from George III, and a successive amount of his sons are going to rule until we get to one very powerful queen in the mid-1800s. Here is George III. We know a lot about him from American history. He was the king during the American Revolution. He's also the king during the French Revolution. He's going to reign until 1820, but not all this time. And in fact, towards the end of his life, it's going to be a regency period where his eldest son, who was a scoundrel to say the least, will be ruler during that period of his illness. We don't know what George III suffered from in terms of why he was erratic and why he had the problems, or was it the medical treatment at the time that created even more problems? We don't know. It's a great mystery. George IV, he was the eldest son of George III and did not get along with his father. He didn't get along with many people. Actually, he's going to marry and try to divorce. In the end, they don't actually get a divorce. They get something called annulled, but he was married to Caroline of Brunswick, who was needless to say, kind of a radical person for her time period. She just did whatever she wanted, basically, and then he's going to try to divorce her for it. He will be, by the time he reigns in 1820, he's drunk, overweight, just had probably riddled with disease. He had lived quite a bad life. He had one daughter, beautiful daughter. She was set to become queen when she dies in childbirth, and so she will never reign. Yet another son of George III becomes king, William IV. Again, he was another man that had lived a long life of doing whatever he wanted. He actually lived with an actress, had probably 11 children with her, when suddenly he realizes, uh-oh, my niece just died in childbirth. That puts me in line to the throne. And he has to kind of settle down and try to have children. He does not succeed, and actually there is a rush through all the brothers to have children to try to have the next ruler of England. In the end, yet another brother will have that child and then promptly die, and she becomes one of the greatest queens in English history. And here is Queen Victoria. She reigns from 1837 to 1901, right to the greatest extent of the British Empire. She actually marries her first cousin, Prince Albert, and they were very, very close, deeply, deeply in love. They have quite a few children. Those children go on to marry into most of the major houses within Europe. Unfortunately, she was also carried a genetic disposition for hemophilia, meaning she passed that genetic trait to her children, who went on to marry into the most famous houses in Europe and pass on hemophilia to those those different famous houses, including in Russia. Hemophilia is a blood disease that only affects male children, so you can imagine the ramifications of this. The last Habsburg king of Spain had been Charles II, and after that, the monarchy then passed to Philip IV, or the House of Bourbon, who was a grandson of Louis XIV of France. From then on out, they had a policy of marrying rather closely with Austria to cement their rule in Spain. King Ferdinand VII of Spain became king of Spain during a time where Spain was still invaded by the French, and then lasted until 1833. He's from the House of Bourbon, and he married Maria Cristina and went on to only have one child, a daughter. When he dies, there's a problem, because before the Bourbons came, there had been just no Salic law. Anybody could inherit the oldest child. If it was female and there was no male could inherit, that's how you got like Queen Isabella of Spain. And vice versa. But once the Bourbons take over, they introduced Salic law. So Ferdinand has to convince the Cortes, or the parliament, to allow his daughter to be queen. He has to overturn that Salic law that came from France and reinstate the old Spanish idea. Unfortunately, his death, his daughter does become queen, and it caused a Carlist split in Spain that continues today. The Carlists will support Franco in the 1930s when he turned Spain into a fascist government. They continue to be a force of conservatism in Spain today. Queen Isabella II of Spain will reign from 1833 to 1868 when she's overthrown by the Cortes, or the parliament. Her mother was from the Kingdom of Naples. Her parents were uncle and niece. I can say no more about that other than she was a frivolous, weak leader at a time of great instability in Spain. Prussia was a state that rose up starting in about the 1300s in the area of Berlin and east of that. It became a very powerful kingdom in the 1600s through military conquest and marriage. By the 1800s, they're expert military leaders and will be leading cause of German unification, which will be our next topic after this. King Frederick Wilhelm III was king of Prussia from 1797 to 1840. His wife was far more famous, though. She was Queen Louise, and she was a very important political advisor. Here is a painting of her meeting with Napoleon, who Napoleon claimed was probably the strongest man in Europe, or he said something like that. And anyways, her early death left the nation of Prussia in just disarray and mourning. Frederick Wilhelm IV married Elizabeth Ludwika of Bavaria of the House of Wittelsbach. So again, we've already seen that the house had a little bit of nutty things going on. He actually had no children and suffered from some mental problems, and as a result, he's going to abdicate in favor of his younger brother, who was raised in the military. They actually have no children, too. Wilhelm I will be king of Prussia during the most important time in German history, the first unification of Germany. So he's going to lead that unification. We're going to see him early on, but he never expected to actually be king of Prussia. He had a brother who was ruling. The brother was married, and he actually fell in love with somebody else who was deemed not important enough. And then he was forced to marry Augusta, Princess Augusta, and so their marriage was not a happy one. She was incredibly liberal. He was more conservative, military, kind of stuffy. You know, he wants to unify Germany, but with Prussia at the head. So very important to German and Italian unification. Otto von Bismarck was a Prussian aristocrat, but yet his mother was a member of the business middle class, and so he was highly educated, most important diplomat of the 1800s. His defeat of Napoleon III during the Franco-Prussian War is going to allow for Rome to ultimately join Italy in the total unification of the Italian peninsula. And lastly, our heroes of Italian unification. They were not leaders, they were not kings, they were not dukes. They were mostly intellectuals, members of the intellectual class or military. Here is Mazzini. He was an intellectual, a teacher, a professor, and he wrote incredible amounts. He was way before his time. He believed in equality of the gender, equality, something unheard of in the 1850s. He believed that actually everybody was equal. He's going to lead the short-lived Roman Republic in 1849 to 1850, but in the end, he won't really see the complete unification of Italy. He will be banished to London. Here's Garibaldi, the muscle, the military might of Italian unification. He's going to lead an expedition of 1,000, all wearing red shirts as they invade Sicily and then move up through the Italian peninsula, unifying everywhere he goes. And then in the end, he's conquered all of southern Italy. He has a choice whether to make himself king or hand it over, and he hands it over to Victor Emmanuel II, who then oversees the total unification of Italy. Lastly, the brain of Italian unification is Count Cavour. In the end, it is his diplomatic and brilliant political maneuvering that oversees the Italian unification in favor of the House of Savoy. So while Victor Emmanuel II becomes the first unified king of Italy, it is Cavour who's a master politician who puts him in place. And that is the end of Italian unification.